Okay, so I am Chris Phoebe. Sorry, I'm not pronouncing your name well. So please, you can just drop a reminder so your other colleagues can join, because I think you're the only one from front end. So please, you can send a message to remind your colleagues on Discord. So we'll have more persons joining the class. So if you can hear me, I am Chris Phoebe. Sorry, I'm not getting your name well. Yeah, so please, you can just drop a reminder on Discord channel so you get your other colleagues to join the call also. Thank you. Okay, Olivia, please, you can kickstart. You can start. Thank you so much. Okay, sorry, he's muted. Miss Amaka, please, can you give him permission to speak? Thank you.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And okay, can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Okay. So we're going to talk about routing with the composition API. First, I'll give a brief intro about myself and who I am. My name is Oliver Ochre. I'm a full stack software engineer and a YouTuber. I work currently at Remo Inc., which is a Ghanaian company which is trying to solve the issue of rent. And also, I'm also an independent contractor. I've worked on a lot of web applications in and out of Ghana, some in Nigeria, some in Zambia, and also in the US and UK. Yeah, that's a bit about myself. So let's jump right into the topic of what we are here to do. Okay, so yeah, what we are here to do is talk about the routing with the composition API. Two things are involved here: the composition API, the routing or the router, with more specifically the view router. So first you have to talk about what's the composition API and the router. I pre-assume that most of the students here have been taught some Vue.js or have a knowledge of what Vue.js is. If not, okay, Vue.js is a progressive framework that is used for building web applications, and it also makes it easier for you to build simple single-page applications as well. All right. Okay, so the composition API is a set of APIs that allows us to author Vue.js components using the import functions and instead of the declarations option. So this is the explanation of the composition API from the official Vue.js.org website. So let me give a bit of history. So before the composition API, Vue.js in its previous version, the version 1 and the version 2, currently we are on Vue version 3, was being written with what we call the options API. So when you go to version 3, there was an improvement or a new way of writing Vue.js code to make it more simpler and also to overcome some of the limitations of the options API. The two main limitations of the options API, which I've listed here, is that there was difficulty in organizing your code. And the next problem was code reusability. You could not organize your code in a more nicer way because you have to keep the logic in a single component. Like you have to keep your logic in multiple parts, but all in a single component. The multiple parts are the data level, the method level, and the components level. Okay, so I'm going to show you how the options API looks like, or when we are writing code in the options API look like. So this is how the options API look like. So you have this data layer here, which is handling all the data that, or the reactiveness of the application. Let's say you need to change some data dynamically, store some states. So it's like actually for state management, but for on the components level. This is the methods that you are going to run in the applications, and they are computed. We also have the computed, which is going to change depending on a particular situation, or it computes itself in the state of like a reactiveness. And there are also life cycle hooks. Yeah, so they have the mounted, before mount, or mount and before mount, and all of that way. So in the options API, we had to separate all these things. Then there was a new invention, which was the composition API. So the composition API solves the two limitations of the options API by, one, allowing us to group relevant piece of code together using hooks. So that was the first problem the composition API. So the second one was that it allows us to reuse our code throughout our application in very easily. And the way you do that is by a process called composables. You create composables that you can use them in different parts of your code. Okay, so this is how the options API looks like. So if I go back to this options API, you see the data is grouped here. We have our methods, our components, and our lifecycle hooks, if there are any. So now we had to separate our contents. They were not mixed together, and in some instances, you might need them to be grouped together to make like the code more readability. You don't have to, if I'm going through a method, you have to come back and infer that this particular data actually exists. It's made maintaining code and writing large application very difficult. So the Vue team thought about it and brought up this composition API. This composition API allows us to group our data, our methods, and our computed and lifecycle hooks all in this setup function. So there are two ways of doing the composition API. It's either a setup function, or the script can be a setup script. Okay, so slides tutorial on the setup function. So this one over here is a reactive, like it just acts like the data layer in the options API. This slide also acts like the method layer. So it provides us with multiple, we can have multiple methods here and now return them, and it will be available for the Vue template to use it. Okay. You can stop me during my lecture if there's any question you want to ask. Okay. So this is the first. So the first problem was allowing us to group our code together, which was done by using the setup function or the setup script. The second one was what is called a composable. So in the options API, for us to be able to use code in multiple places or reuse our code, we had to do a lot of work. So these composables was a breeze in the new, in Vue 3. It solved a lot of problem, and I really enjoy using it with the introduction of things like ref, which are reactive, even outside a Vue component. It's made writing Vue.js code very interesting and even more easier than it was in the Vue 3. Even as than it was in the view too, sorry. So this is how a composable look like. So this is a composable that I'm using in one of my application. So it's allow us to find a particular user with their shared code. Or when you are done, we export the composable here, and any other component that wants to consume it can consume it, just like this one. So something like handle login is a composable that I've written somewhere, but I'm consuming it here. I just import it in here, then I just use it. That's like a breeze. In options API, you can't do that. You have to write it, and it was messed up. So because you needed to access the data from the method, so you couldn't do that kind of activities. Okay. All right. So that's it for the introduction of the view, the composition API, and what the composition API is about and what it solves. So now let's jump into the view router. Just as I said, it's two things you're handling here: the composition API and the view router. Before we join them together. So the view router is the official library for page navigation in the view app, in almost every view application, or the default one, if my memory serves me right. And it's very simple to use, but very powerful. Okay, so how the view router works, that it makes routing easier by allowing us to map our components to a route and allowing the view router to handle the rendering of the application or the particular component you want to show. So I'm saying the particular component you want to show is that because Vue.js allows us to create single page application. When I say single page application, what I mean is that when you hit a particular web page that is being built with Vue.js, you get served only one index.html, and the rest of the routing that happens is taken care by Vue.js or the framework. So the framework does not go back to the network, it does not go back to the server to go and get individual page. Let's say you hit the website first and you get /index. When you want to go to /contact, it does not allow you to go back to the server to go and get a new HTML and come and serve it in the browser. What it does is that it's mounts a component, which is the current component, and mounts the component that you wish to go to. Okay, so let me go to the next slide. That has an example of how the view router looks like. Okay, so this is how you the routes are listed and how a route is created. So you have a path and you can give the component the route a name, but the two things that are needed are the path and the name. Okay, you can also have individual route guides for more about the route guides later as you go along. So you have a path and you have a component. Those are the two main things you need. So when you go to /index, you are going to show the home component. When you go to /auth, you're going to show the auth component. So all the view package is doing that. It's on mounting, what the view router is doing that. It's on mounting a particular component and mounting the components that belongs to the route you wish to go to. Okay. Yeah, so that's what the view router is about. So, so the question we should ask ourselves now is that what changed in using the view router since you transitioned from the composition API, from the options API to the composition API. So even the Vue.js websites recommend that you use the composition API over the options API to give you more benefits and also solve the limitations that were encountered in the previous build of the options API. Okay, but you can even use the two together. You can use the options API and the composition API together in one template. it doesn't hurt. It has no problem, but I would advise you not to do that. All right, so what changed? So two things change, just two things change. The first thing that changes how we access the router or how we access the route. The second thing that changes in components navigation guards. Okay, so when you are using every single app application, a single page application, and you are trying to use their router for navigations, there are two things that are of main concern to you when it comes to the router. When it comes to routing, first thing is the router. The second thing is the route. Okay. I say those two things are the most important to you, whether you are using React, you are using Vue, you are using Svelte, or any other cool single app application framework you want to use. The router, because you will have to push your user throughout the life cycle of your application or the flow, the user story that you want to tell them. And the route, because there might be some changes in the route that you want to catch or you want to use to handle your own logic. Let's say you go to user/1, you might want to show Oliver there, but when you go to user/2, you want to show Emanuela there. Yes. So those are the two things when it comes to using a router for a single page application that are important. And in the in-component navigation, they say Vue.js thing. So we're going to talk about it as you go along. So how did accessing the router change? Did the router disappear or did it go in a different place? So when we're using the options API, this is how you are supposed to get access to the router or the route. Okay, so for you to access the router, you have to do this $router.push, or with anything that you want to do on the router, you have to access it through this $router. Okay, so this $router, because the whole Vue.js application was just one big object, which is the this, and it has a lot of properties on it that which has been injected into it. So when you bootstrap your application and you want to use the router, the Vue.js router, you have to provide it for it. So you inject it into that particular instance of the Vue.js application. So the router becomes available globally for you to use. So in that instance, for you to access that particular router, you have to go and get it on the particular Vue.js instance you have. So you have to do it through the this.router before you can do anything on the router. So if you want to push to a particular route, you can do that. If you want to walk through the history with the this.router.go, you can do that with but you have to use this way, this.router, this.$router. Let's say you want to access the route params or have some context about the particular route that you are on, you have to go through the this.route. Yeah, so that is the first thing you have to know about accessing the router in the composition in the options API. But when you move into the composition API, the composition API provides reusable functions or things we call hooks that allows us to have access to the router instead of injecting it or putting it directly on the Vue.js instance or accessing it from the Vue.js disk. Okay, so inside the setup function, you don't have access to the disk. So for you to access the router, you have to use the hooks. Okay, so for you to access this particular router in the Vue.js composition API setup or the setup script, you have to use the useRouter function, which is being exported by the Vue router. I forgot to add it here. So you just import useRouter, and if you want to use the router, you have to go through the use route. Yeah. So when you have access to it, then the rest is up to you. You can do all your manual activities, go through a push, do a go, and walk through the history you can do everything that you did, you could do with the options API. You can do the same thing with the composition API. All you need to do is first get hold of your hook, then instantiate the router and use it. That is it. So this is how you access the router. So the next thing that changed for routing with the composition API was in-component guards. Okay, so before we talk about in-component guards, you have to talk about what's navigation, in-component navigation bar. So navigation guards, sorry. So before we talk about what navigation guards are, in-component navigation guards are, you have to talk about navigation guards. So navigation guards are provided by the view router. Provided by the view router are primarily used to guard navigation either by redirecting or canceling the routing to that particular component. Just as I said in the view router part, that the view router is just a map of path and the component that should be mounted based on that particular path that you are on. When you are about to enter a particular component or a particular component is about to be mounted, the set of checks that have to be made before that particular component is mounted. So the first thing that some of the steps that it does is that it confirms, it checks the global or on the global router, are there particular guards that are supposed to be checked before we go on? When it checks that and it's all passes. So for a guard to fail you, the guard has to return a false. A guard is simply a function that returns two things. That can return either of these two things, either true or false. When it returns a false, it means that access denied. You are not allowed to be you are not to be allowed routing to that particular component. And when it returns true, then it means you have access to that particular component. Okay, so that's what a guard is. But it goes through a series of guard checking from the global level, then goes to the individual component, before enter guards. Then it comes to the in-component guards. So the in-component guards there are basically three. So they are the before route enter, the before route update, and before route leave. Just as I've left some comments down here. So the before route enter is called before the routes that render this component is confirmed. It does not have access to this component. So this is in the context of the composition API. So this is in component navigation guards in the composition API. Okay, so it does not have access to this instance or this component instance because it is not yet created. The component has not yet been created. Okay, sorry. No. The second one is the before routes update. It is called when the route that renders this component has changed, but this component is used in the new route. For example, given a route with a param, a route that looks like this. So when we navigate to routes user/1 and user/2, it is still using the same component, but something has changed, which is the route parameter. So the route has to update itself, either fetching the user details or doing a particular action based on the particular user's ID. Okay, and the last but not the least is the before route leaves. So this is called when the routes that renders this component is about to be navigated away from. Let's say I'm moving from /home to /contacts. That's when this particular route card is called. So by default, if you don't implement these things, it just returns true by default if you don't implement them. Okay. But if you implement them and you want to use them, if you want to give access to that particular component, you have to return true. But if you don't want to give access to that particular component, you return false, and view router will take control of that. So this is how you did that. You would have done that if you are using the composition API or the options API. But for the composition API, that's how it's going to look like. Okay. So this, I remember to add the import statement. Okay, so this is how it have looked at like in the composition API. So in the composition API, just as I said, everything in composition API is by using the hooks which have been provided for you. So instead of having a property or a field in the default exported object, which is before routes enter, you have a hook which is called on before route leave, which does the same thing as this thing here. The only thing that changed is that we are giving you access to hooks to use instead of having to put them directly on the component instance. Okay, so we have access to the before routes and before routes leave, before routes update, and before routes enter, the same naming, just some change in the caps and with the on in front of it. Yes, so this the two main things that change in the composition API or in using using routing with composition API. I think I'm at the end of my slides. So are there any questions?
Okay, so everyone, please, if you have questions, please just kindly drop it on the chat, or you can raise your hands and we'll allow you to speak. Okay, apart from Yemi, okay, yeah, Mr. Ife, sorry, you can speak and ask your question. Thank you. You can speak up, please.
Okay. Good evening, Mr.
Good evening.
Good evening. Okay, so my question is actually very simple. You made mention that I don't think I get it correctly though, but you mentioned that when using a composition API, you're allowing access to a host or something. I could not really get that part clearly, so I just want to ask if you can go over the last part again.
Come again.
You made mention of getting access to connection host to something. I could not hear you clearly. So that's why I wanted to ask again if you can go over that last part again.
Okay, so I was saying that in the composition API, the only thing that changed was the introduction of hooks, which allows us to do those things that we're doing in the options API, but do it more easier with the implementation of hooks. Yeah. Exactly.
Okay, I think you just said you understood, Olivia. If you can hear me, you made mention of that on the chat.
Yeah, I've seen it.
Okay, so if any other person have any question, please, you can drop it on the chat, or you can raise your hands and you can ask your question. So please, if you have any question, you can identify by raising your hands, or you can drop your questions on the chat. Okay, I believe every person understood. Okay, I think I just saw. Okay, yes. So someone just dropped a question on the chat.
Okay, so I think I'm going to go.
Two persons.
Yeah. So I'll start with I am Chris. So what is the future for applications built with Options API? Okay, so you can build very large applications with the Options API. The side effect is that once the application begins to become larger and larger, you begin to become bottleneck. That in the case that there might be things that you want to share across, you have problems with that. Code readability, whilst the code becomes very large and large, you want to maintain it, and it becomes difficult for someone or a new person joining your team, very difficult to join your team and be able to move faster. Yeah. So can I use the Options API? Yes, you can do that. You can use the Options API and the Composition API simultaneously in a component. It works and you don't have any problem, but I won't advise that you should do that. Can the Options API be using a system architecture or cloud computing? Oh, no, you can't. I think I've exhausted all the questions. Any more questions?
Okay, guys. So please, if you have any other question, please, you can ask your question now. If not, we'll be wrapping up this session. So please, for everyone on this call, if you have questions, please, you can drop your questions on the chat or you can raise your hands and ask your question. Okay, so while we wait for those who have questions, I'll quickly drop his LinkedIn profile here. So you can connect with him. So I'll drop the link so you can connect with him via LinkedIn. And if you have questions as regards to the class or as regards Vue, you can reach out to him via LinkedIn. So I'm going to drop his URL on the chat. So please, everyone, click on the link and connect with him. Thank you. So let me do that now.
Good evening. I have just one question. Can you just show us a live, a practical work on how to use Options API?
Come again?
Can you just show us a little practical application on how to use Options API?
The Options API. Okay. The Options or the Composition API?
Anyone will do. Anyone will do, actually.
Okay, sure. I think I have one. Okay, let me show my screen. Desktop. Desktop, share. Okay. Okay, can you see my screen now?
Yes, we can.
All right. Okay, so this is an anonymous platform that I built using Vue.js and Django. So the Django is for the backend and Vue.js is for the front end. Let me run it online. I hope it's even up. Okay. So, Okay, so this how it looks like. It's an anonymous messaging platform that allows you to send messages to your friend, and they compliment. You can give them a compliment, tell them how you feel about them, and they will know it's either coming from you or it's coming from another person. Okay, so this is I use composition API throughout. So this is how your composition API works. Some of the codes, I think I use them as the snippets for my presentation. So what I was talking about, the composables. So a composable like handle login. So this is how the composable looks like. Let me hide this. Yeah. So that's how a composable looks like. So with the introduction of the Vue version 3 and the composition API, this ref, which is a reactive object or a reactive, it's a reactive object, is allowed to be used outside a normal Vue.js file. It can be used in a normal JavaScript file or a TypeScript file. So you can have data like state management using this reactive states here or the ref. So you have something like this, the composable for logging in. When you are done, you export the data that you have and the function that you are running with this particular composable. Yeah. And when you go into the application, this is the composition API. I just get the composable, and whenever I want to call the login, I just run my login over here. Yeah, so this is how it looks like for the composition API. Let me see whether if I can get something for the options API. I don't think I have options API in this PC, but it looks like this. I did a sample code somewhere. I can use a sample code here. So I can just have data and return the state. So let's say name. So then you have your methods. And you have your compute over here. So these things over here, which I have grouped everything together, I can break everything down into an options API. That means this username and password will be inside the data layer. This handle submit will be in the method, and accessing of the router this way will not be done. We will just do it with the let's say you have handle submit. Just have something like this dot router, this dot dollar router dot push. Then we just push to a particular route you want to go to without Google. Yeah, so that's how it looks like in the composition world, and this how in the options world, and this how it looks like in the composition world. So you can mix them together, but I won't advise you do such. Is that fine? Any other questions?
Okay, hello everyone. If you have any question, please say your question or drop it on the chat. But if you understood, you can just type in on the chat that you understood every part of today's class. Okay, I don't think there's any question. Yeah, Olivia, I don't know if you can hear me.
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, yeah, so I believe the students, they are clarified on every part. And thank you so much for taking us on today's class. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you so much for teaching our students today. So everyone, please, I dropped the URL. So it's LinkedIn profile. So please click on the link and it take you directly.
All
So
right.
it's okay. They're asking for, please, could we get access to your GitHub? So I don't know if you could make that possible.
Yeah,
Olivia.
so I've dropped my YouTube channels. Okay, so let me get my tab. And there we go. So that's also my GitHub.
Okay, so please, everyone, you can access it from the chat. Please, can I access it from the chat? Okay, so before we close today's class, is there anybody with any question? Is there anyone with any question? Or if you understood, just type in you understood every part before I wrap up. And we'll come to the end of today's session, please. Okay, yeah, so I believe we are clear on every part. All right, so thank you once again, Olivia. And thank you so much for everyone that joined today's class. So please make use of all the links on the chat and